The restaurant glowed with polished elegance, chandeliers dangling from high ceilings and soft golden light dancing over the glossy tables. Businessmen laughed in hushed tones, wealthy couples clinked their wine glasses, and waiters glided effortlessly between tables like trained performers on a stage. Among them, tucked into a pressed but faded uniform, was a young waitress named Clara. She tried to mask her nerves with a polite smile, but inside, the constant pressure of bills, overdue rent, and her mother's medicine weighed heavier than the tray she balanced in her hands. Tonight, the weight felt unbearable. Her steps slowed as she approached the corner table, the one reserved for the restaurant's most important guest of the night. A man whose name alone sent managers into a frenzy and had the staff polishing silverware until it gleamed like mirrors. Alexander Knight, billionaire CEO, ruthless entrepreneur, a man known for transforming struggling companies into empires with a single stroke of his pen. Clara had only ever seen his face in magazines and news broadcasts, where people described him as powerful, intimidating, untouchable. And now, she was the one bringing him his meal. "Keep your hands steady," she whispered to herself, though her voice trembled. With careful precision, she lowered the tray onto his table. The aroma of roasted duck and truffle potatoes filled the air, yet Alexander barely looked at it. His attention was buried in a thick stack of papers spread across the table, a pen tapping rhythmically against the glass beside him. Clara placed the plate in front of him. "Your dinner, sir." He gave the briefest nod, eyes still fixed on the documents. His presence radiated control, an aura so commanding it made Clara feel invisible. She turned to step away, relieved that the moment had passed without incident, when her eyes flickered down. Her breath caught. On the corner of one page, just barely visible, was a mark she knew better than her own handwriting. The ink curled in a familiar swoop, the letters forming with the same slant she had once watched over and over as a child, sitting at a worn wooden desk while her father signed checks, forms, and birthday cards with equal care. Her father's signature. It was impossible. He had died years ago, penniless and broken after his small company collapsed. Clara had spent nights listening to her mother cry in the kitchen, blaming fate, blaming the cruel world of business that had swallowed her husband whole. And yet here, in the hands of the most powerful man she had ever seen, was her father's unmistakable mark. She froze, her tray pressed tight to her chest. The room spun as memories flooded her. Her father laughing at the dinner table, his hands calloused but gentle, the way he'd scribble his signature quickly on her school forms with a smile. "There you go, pumpkin." Her lips moved before she could stop herself. "Sir, that's my dad's signature." The words were barely above a whisper, but they pierced through the low hum of the restaurant like glass shattering. Alexander's hand paused mid-tap. Slowly, as though the world had tilted off its axis, he lifted his gaze from the papers and locked eyes with her. For the first time that evening, his cold, steel-like composure cracked. His brows furrowed, and a flicker of confusion crossed his face. "What did you just say?" His voice was deep, commanding, yet laced with something else, a tremor beneath the surface. Clara's hands shook, and she nearly dropped the tray. "That signature," she stammered, pointing with trembling fingers. It's my dad's. I'd recognize it anywhere." For a moment, silence swallowed the room. Then, as if struck by an unseen force, Alexander's grip on the glass loosened. The crystal slipped from his fingers and fell, shattering against the marble floor. Gasps rippled through the restaurant. Waiters stopped in their tracks. Customers turned their heads. And Clara, her heart hammering in her chest, stood frozen as the billionaire CEO stared at her like she had just unearthed a ghost from his past. The glass lay in jagged pieces across the marble floor, the sound of its shattering still hanging in the air like a gunshot. Conversations hushed, forks hovered mid-air, and the symphony of clinking cutlery that had filled the luxurious dining room moments ago fell into uneasy silence. All eyes flicked to Alexander Knight, the untouchable billionaire whose control over every situation was legendary. For the first time, the patrons of that restaurant saw him look rattled. Clara's knees weakened beneath her, and for a second she wished she could vanish. Her heart pounded in her chest so hard she thought it might break through her uniform. She hadn't meant to speak, hadn't meant to interrupt his world, but the words had spilled out like an unstoppable tide. She bent quickly to gather the shards of glass, but Alexander's voice stopped her. "Leave it," he said, low but firm, his eyes never leaving hers. The manager rushed forward, bowing nervously. "Mr. Knight, we apologize. We'll have this cleaned right away." He shot Clara a glare sharp enough to cut, a silent warning that she had overstepped. But Alexander lifted one hand to silence him. "I want to speak to her," he said. The room stiffened. The staff exchanged glances, unsure whether this was a dismissal, a threat, or something else entirely. Clara's throat went dry as the manager reluctantly backed away, muttering reassurances to other guests who were now staring with shameless curiosity. Alexander leaned back slowly in his chair, the weight of his gaze pinning her to the spot. His face, usually an unreadable mask, carried something unusual now, confusion, maybe even disbelief. He gestured to the seat across from him. "Sit." Clara hesitated, every instinct screaming that she was crossing a line no waitress should dare. But her legs seemed to move of their own accord. She lowered herself into the leather chair, her palms clammy against her apron. "Explain yourself," he demanded, tapping the papers with one long finger. "What do you mean? That's your father's signature." She swallowed hard. I know it sounds impossible, sir. But my father, Richard Hale, he used to own a small company. Before it went under. That signature," she pointed, her hand trembling, "I grew up watching him sign it 100 times. On bills, on my school forms, even on silly little notes he'd leave for me and my mom. I could never mistake it." Alexander's jaw tightened. The name, Richard Hale, seemed to strike something inside him. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Clara caught a flicker of recognition. "Richard Hale," he repeated under his breath, as though testing the weight of the name on his tongue. Memories seemed to tug at him, pulling his gaze to the past. Clara leaned forward slightly, her voice cracking. "My dad worked his whole life to keep his company afloat. But he lost everything. We lost everything. He died before he could recover. My mom and I have been struggling ever since." The words felt heavy as they left her lips, and her eyes burned with the effort of holding back tears. Alexander's hand clenched into a fist on the table. He remembered now. Richard Hale, the man who had once been part of a deal that changed everything. A man who had signed documents that shifted the balance of power in the industry, documents Alexander had benefited from. But the details were hazy, buried under years of contracts, acquisitions, and the ruthless climb to the top. "You're telling me Richard Hale was your father," he said finally, his voice quieter now, almost hoarse. "Yes," Clara whispered. "Why? Do you know him?" Alexander didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back, his eyes fixed on the signature like it was a ghost on paper. The restaurant buzz returned faintly around them, but between the two of them was a silence that felt impenetrable. He could feel the past clawing its way back, a past he had buried beneath wealth, power, and the illusion of control. For the first time in decades, Alexander Knight was unsure of himself. The waitress in front of him wasn't just another nameless server, she was a thread leading back to a story he thought was long dead. "Bring me everything you have," he said suddenly, his voice firm again. "Photographs, letters, anything. If you're telling the truth, Miss Hale, then this changes everything." Clara blinked, startled by his sudden intensity. "What do you mean?" Alexander's gaze hardened, though the crack in his composure remained. "It means your father and I were bound by more than a signature. And it's time the truth came out." Alexander sat in his penthouse office later that night, the skyline of the city glittering like a million cold stars behind him. The restaurant encounter replayed in his mind over and over, the trembling voice of the waitress, the unmistakable recognition in her eyes, and that name, Richard Hale. A name he had not spoken in nearly 2 decades, yet one that now refused to leave his thoughts. He poured himself a glass of scotch, but it did nothing to dull the gnawing unease. Instead, he found himself rifling through the endless rows of locked cabinets and digital archives that documented his empire's rise. Richard Hale. The man had once been small-time, a dreamer with a company too fragile for the ruthless market. Alexander remembered him as earnest, almost naive, but brilliant in his way. And he remembered something else. Papers signed in desperation, a transaction that had paved the way for Knight Enterprises' meteoric rise. Back then, Alexander had convinced himself it was just business. Hale had chosen to sign. Yet now, With Hale's daughter staring at him with those accusing eyes, he could no longer hide behind the excuse of contracts. His assistant, a loyal man named Foster, entered quietly. "Sir, you asked for records from the Hale transaction." Alexander nodded, motioning for him to set the files on the desk. He dismissed Foster with a curt wave and pulled the thick folder closer. Dust coated its edges, like it had been forgotten deliberately. He flipped through page after page. Contracts, buyouts, signatures. And there it was, Richard Hale's name scrawled at the bottom of a document that effectively surrendered his company's patents to Alexander for a fraction of their worth. Those patents had become the backbone of Knight Enterprises' success, the stepping stone from which Alexander built his empire. Alexander's chest tightened. He could almost hear Hale's voice, weary yet determined. "I'm doing this for my family." He hadn't understood it then. Now, faced with Hale's daughter scraping by as a waitress, he felt the full weight of it. Memories flashed in fragments. Hale meeting him in a cramped office, papers spread out on a desk scarred with years of wear. Hale's hand shaking slightly as he signed away his legacy. The trust in his eyes, the belief that Alexander would uphold an unspoken promise of fairness. But Alexander had been younger, hungrier. Fairness had no place in his vocabulary then. He sank into his chair, pressing his palms to his face. "What did I do?" he muttered to the empty room. The sound of the city hummed through the glass walls, mocking him with its ceaseless energy. All these years, he had thought himself self-made, a titan who had clawed his way to the top through brilliance and strategy. But now, the ugly truth surfaced. His foundation had been built on another man's sacrifice. A man whose family had been left in ruins. Clara's face returned to his mind. The quiet fire in her voice when she said, "That's my dad's signature." She wasn't accusing, not yet. She was bewildered, lost between grief and recognition. But Alexander knew, if she learned the full truth, she would see him as nothing more than the thief who stole her father's future. His hand hovered over the file. He considered shredding it, burying the evidence once more. With his power, he could erase every trace of Richard Hale from the records. The world would continue to worship Alexander Knight, the genius billionaire. But when he closed his eyes, he saw Hale's tired smile. He saw Clara carrying trays in a cheap uniform, her life a shadow of what it could have been. For the first time in years, guilt struck deep. It was raw, unfamiliar, and unrelenting. A knock at the door pulled him back. Foster stepped in again. "Sir, the board is pressing for tomorrow's agenda. They want your decision on the new merger." Alexander looked up, his eyes dark with conflict. "Cancel it," he said flatly. "Cancel." Foster blinked. "But sir, the deal." "I said cancel it." His tone brooked no argument. "There are more important matters at hand." When Foster left, Alexander leaned over the desk, fingers tracing the faded ink of Hale's signature. For years, it had been just another line on just another contract. Now, it was a ghostly reminder of a debt unpaid. He whispered into the silence, though no one could hear him, "Richard, I owe you. And I owe her." In that moment, Alexander knew there would be no going back. The truth had clawed its way to the surface, and it demanded a reckoning. The boardroom was silent, its glass walls reflecting the early morning sun as it streamed across the city skyline. Dozens of suits sat around the long polished table, their expressions a mix of confusion and irritation. They had expected the usual: quarterly reports, aggressive expansion plans, another bold declaration from the man who had built their empire. Instead, Alexander Knight sat at the head of the table, uncharacteristically still, a thick folder of documents resting in front of him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its usual sharpness. "Before we begin," he said, "there is something I need to address." A murmur rippled through the board members. Foster stood off to the side, uneasy. Then the doors opened. Every head turned as Clara stepped hesitantly into the room, her waitress uniform replaced by a simple dress, her nervous hands twisting the strap of her purse. She looked wildly out of place in this chamber of power, but Alexander's steady gaze anchored her. "Miss Hale," he said, gesturing to the seat beside him, "please, sit." The board members exchanged baffled looks. Who was this young woman, and why was she here? Clara lowered herself into the chair, her heart thundering as she avoided their eyes. Alexander opened the folder and pushed the first document forward. The paper was old, edges yellowed, the ink faded but unmistakable. The signature glistened like a scar from the past. This, Alexander said slowly, is the signature of Richard Hale. A man who once owned a company that should have been a legacy for his family. Clara's eyes burned, staring at her father's handwriting. He was your father, Alexander continued, his voice steady but heavy with guilt. And he was the reason I stand where I am today. Gasps spread through the room. A board member leaned forward, incredulous. Mr. Knight, what are you saying? Alexander rose from his chair, his towering frame commanding the room. Yet he didn't look like the untouchable titan they knew. He looked human, haunted. I'm saying that the foundation of Knight Enterprises was built on a man's sacrifice. Richard Hale signed away his patents to me for far less than they were worth. Those patents became the backbone of this empire. And while I rose, his family fell into poverty. Clara's throat tightened. She had expected. She wasn't sure what she expected. Denial, evasion, but not this brutal honesty. The board erupted in whispers. This is madness, one man said sharply. Bringing up ancient history serves no purpose. We owe nothing to this girl. Alexander slammed his hand against the table, the sound echoing like thunder. We owe everything to this girl. His voice thundered with conviction, his eyes blazing with something the board had never seen before, remorse. Without Richard Hale, there would be no Knight Enterprises. Without his sacrifice, we would not be sitting in this tower of glass and steel. The room stilled, the weight of his words undeniable. Alexander turned to Clara. For the first time, his hardened features softened. Your father trusted me, and I failed him. I can't undo the past. But I will not let his daughter live in the shadow of my fortune any longer. He opened another folder and slid it across to her. Clara's trembling fingers lifted the document. Her breath caught as she read. Transfer of shares, property rights, financial restitution, numbers so staggering they blurred before her eyes. I am transferring a portion of this company to you, Alexander said, his voice resolute. Not as charity, as your rightful inheritance. You are not a waitress in a faded uniform, Clara. You are Richard Hale's daughter. And his legacy belongs with you. The room erupted again, outrage clashing with disbelief. You can't do this. A board member barked. You're handing billions to a stranger. Alexander's gaze cut through them like ice. She is not a stranger. She is the daughter of the man who gave me everything. And if any of you cannot stand behind that, then step aside. Because this is happening. Clara's hands shook as tears streamed down her face. She could barely find her voice. Why would you do this for me? Alexander's jaw tightened, and for a fleeting moment, the ruthless CEO was gone, replaced by a man weighed down by conscience. Because I should have done it years ago. Because your father deserved better. And because I refused to let his daughter suffer for my sins any longer. The room was silent now, no one daring to interrupt. Clara clutched the documents, her tears falling onto the ink. The life she had known, of scraping by, of endless struggle, was shifting beneath her feet, replaced by something unimaginable. And Alexander Knight, the man who had built an empire on ambition, finally tasted redemption not in another acquisition, but in giving back what was never truly his.